Yeah, thank you. So I am Brian Elrott. I'm NOAA Fisheries Central Valley Chinook Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Coordinator, and I'm presenting today with Hannah Moan. She's our new, excuse me, lead biologist for the Lassen tributaries, so Mill, Deer, Antelope Creek, and a few others. We'd like to, well, I will say we made this presentation for 10 minutes because that's the amount of time we thought we had. So remember the kindness we're doing y'all for doing a shorter presentation here. But we just wanted to convey, the purpose of our talk is really to convey how important these creeks are to spring run Chinook salmon and steelhead recovery, and how important the board's flow setting process is to protecting these valuable species, and hopefully provide some information that's helpful to the scientific basis report. Next slide, please. So we've heard how Mill and Deer spring run are among the last, wild extant spring run populations in the valley, along with Butte Creek. And they've persisted for several thousands of years at least, largely because they still have access to their historical high elevation spawning habitat. We've heard that from Tim and previously from Matt. Maybe one thing I'll highlight here is just the climate change resilient piece, because they still have access to that historical habitat. And we're really, this is kind of a transition zone between Southern Cascades and the Sierras, so we're still getting some spring influence into these creeks. Cordellini et al. 2021 showed, they did a climate change projection, out to August 2080, and even in that sort of long time frame, they projected suitable habitat for spring run in the upper portions of Mill and Deer Creeks should persist until that time frame, and a little bit in Battle Creek as well. But really, there's the amount of suitable habitat out when you look out that far is very limited. So it speaks to the need to preserve these populations. Next slide, please. So here, just continuing on with some characteristics for Mill and Deer that make them unique, because of, they've had that access to their spawning and rearing habitat. They've maintained the genetic and life history diversity that allowed them to persist for such a long period of time. Here, the figure also from Cordellini et al. 2021 is comparing really the timing of outmigration for juveniles from the creeks. So, and sort of comparing Mill Deer to Butte Creek. This is with a otolith analysis. The otolith increment number is really a proxy for size and age. But the takeaway is, when the fish are leaving Mill and Deer, they are, sorry, my boss is like chatting me right now, not on this, but when they leave Mill and Deer, they do it over, diversity of size and age. And really, they're the only systems in the Central Valley that produce yearlings. We don't really see yearling spring run Chinook salmon anywhere else in the valley. Maybe a little bit in Butte Creek, but for the most part, these are the places that have the last remaining sort of yearling life history strategy. And the research shows that those fish tend to do better in drought and poor ocean conditions. And really, so you're seeing the portfolio effect, giving these depending on which the fish go out over different range of sizes and ages, that's going to increase their chances of hitting good conditions downstream. My boss really wants to get me right now. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and we've heard, how mill and deer are the last populations, but here's a historical population structure of spring run. There were 18 viable independent populations throughout the valley. As Matt said, Antelope Creek historically supported a dependent population. And we're really just left with, like I said before, next slide. The mill and deer populations, and the other blue line there is Butte Creek, like we've talked about. So because those populations have persisted, they have that historical life history diversity and important genetics. They're really sought after for reintroduction efforts like the San Joaquin River reintroduction program. But instead of being able to use them for that, they are going extinct, as Matt showed. Next slide, please. So this is our 5-year review viability analysis. NOAA Fisheries does a 5-year review to see if threatened and endangered species need to change their status. Here's the viability portion of that. You can see these populations have been at high risk in all but 2015. The most recent analysis was in 2022 using data through 2021. Next slide, please. And as Matt said, the extinction risk is increasing, and we know that from specific numbers that Matt showed, but you can see on the figure here, we're watching an extirpation event. And in response to this, next slide, Matt covered this emergency action effort as well, but this is CDFW, Fish and Wildlife Service assisted as well, but collecting juveniles in the wild to bring them into captivity so we can preserve the remaining genetic diversity and hopefully raise these juveniles to adults and spawn, and then have some numbers of fish to repopulate the creeks with. And I put these in here, and next slide as well. All right. Just to really drive home the point, I mean, these should be like gut punch, like heartstring pulling images here. These valuable fish cannot survive in the wild anymore because of what we do to them, and the in-stream flow issues within the creeks and the Sacramento River, and a host of other threats. But I'd like to see, in terms of like experiencing wild salmon in the valley, I encourage folks to go to mill deer and Antelope Creeks, and those places leave their mark on you. You will feel something if you're there, especially when there are salmon running in the river. And I think we would all like to see that continue for our kids to be able to experience that same feeling. So this is, that sort of emergency context. Stepping back from that, we want to kind of put this in the context of our recovery plan and recovery of these species. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to do that.
Thanks, Brian. As mentioned, my name is Hannah, and I'm the Endangered Species Act Section 7 Natural Resource Management Specialist at NOAA Fisheries in their Central Valley office. And today I'll be going over our recovery plan and how it relates to in-stream flow requirements that we're discussing today. So the implementation of our recovery plan for the Sacramento River winter run Chinook salmon, the Central Valley spring run Chinook salmon, and the California Central Valley steelhead is vital to the continued persistence and recovery of these populations. And you can see pictured here on the right, our recovery plan is a comprehensive plan that serves as a roadmap for species recovery. So it lays out our actions to reduce or eliminate threats to these endangered and threatened populations as well as their critical habitats. And to help guide these threat abatement efforts, watersheds that are currently occupied by at least one of the listed Chinook salmon and steelhead species have been prioritized among 3 levels. And Matt mentioned this in his presentation. There are Core 1 populations that are of highest priority, and they're listed as Core 1 if they're identified by supporting independent viable populations within that watershed. Core 2 populations have the potential to support dependent populations. And finally, Core 3 have the potential to support intermittent populations. So again, here on the left, you can see that Mill and Deer Creeks are considered Core 1 watersheds for spring run Chinook salmon and steelhead. And then Antelope Creek is a Core 1 watershed for steelhead and a Core 2 for spring run. And this just drives home again that Mill Deer and Antelope Creeks are all highly important for the recovery of Chinook salmon and steelhead. Next slide, please. And similarly, recovery actions have also been prioritized within each watershed to guide where to place these recovery efforts. And priority 1 actions are those critical actions that address the most important threats to the species. Priority 2 actions address threats of moderate importance. And finally, priority 3 actions are among the least important to implement. And these actions are based on the best available science and best professional judgment. And then just to note before continuing, there are other priority 1 actions, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're discussing flows. And restoring in-stream flows are all ranked as priority 1 actions for Mill Deer and Antelope Creeks in our recovery plan. Next slide, please. And our office has also recently been working on the Central Valley Office recovery priorities to focus our efforts over the next 5 years. And before continuing about what these priorities are, I'll go into this document versus the recovery plan that was just mentioned. And the key difference is that this document here is it includes recovery priorities that are more up to date because this has just recently been published. And it also lays out our priorities for the entire Central Valley region across all of our listed species under jurisdiction of our office. So the first priority that you can see here listed is the recovery of spring run in Mill Deer and Butte Creeks. And that is with the focus on protecting in-stream flows for upstream and downstream migration and success of these species. And we need those in-stream flow protections for both of these creeks and the Sacramento River as a whole. But for these creeks specifically, in-stream flow protections can be completed by the State Water Resource Control Board scientific basis report that we're discussing here today, and then following up by implementing those minimum in-stream flow requirements. And this highlights the importance of the board's flow setting process to the species recovery. And before going on to the final slide, there are some grayed out priorities here as well. And for the purposes of this presentation and time today, we won't be going into those other high priority actions, but we wanted to note them here just so you can compare and see how important in-stream flows in Mill and Deer Creeks really are and compared to these other priorities. And next slide, please. All right, to summarize, I will list these key takeaways just to drive home our message here today and wrap up what Brian and I have been talking about. Our first takeaway is that spring run Chinook salmon in Mill and Deer Creeks are 2 of the 3 wild salmon runs that are remaining in the Central Valley, with the third being Butte Creek. Our second takeaway is that more protective flows are needed in Mill Deer and Antelope Creek and within the Sacramento River as a whole to prevent spring run extirpation. The third point is that the flow setting process is critical to the continued persistence of these salmonids in these 3 creeks. And the fourth is we recommend achieving in-stream flow criteria based on the best available science that has been identified in CDFW's flow studies that Matt talked about a bit today. And last but not least, our greatest takeaway today here is that we're grateful to the board for going through this process, and we at NIMS are committed to working with Mill Deer and Antelope Creek water users, the State Water Resource Control Board, and CDFW to develop these in-stream flow solutions that protect these valuable salmonid populations. And next slide, please. Okay, and that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.